power-hungry homes and businesses are driving demand for electricity across the country. Keeping up with that appetite is a practical and economic necessity. The Prime Minister says growing the grid is critical. Mark Carney wants to double capacity, and he's launched a new initiative to get it done.
Electricity demand in Canada is expected to double by 2050. So we will double our grid. That's the headline. Canada will double its electricity generation over the course of the next 2 decades. Because the path to affordability is electrification. The path to competitiveness is electrification. The path to net zero is electrification. Electrification underpins everything.
Canada is about to build one of the massive power plants in its history, and it could change the country forever. The country wants more clean power, faster growth, and a stronger future for families and businesses. And this giant project will become one of the boldest moves Canada has ever made. Prime Minister Mark Carney stood on Parliament Hill in Ottawa and unveiled Canada's long-awaited National Electricity Strategy. The document carries a price tag that makes it one of the most ambitious infrastructure commitments in Canadian history. The strategy says construction will cost more than $1 trillion, and public dollars will be used to cover some of the cost. The central objective is to double Canada's electricity grid by 2050, taking a national power system that currently produces approximately 700 terawatt hours of electricity annually and expanding it to meet demand that analysts project will roughly double as electric vehicles, AI data centers, industrial electrification, and population growth require significantly more power than the current grid can deliver. Doubling generation in the next few decades will require massive investment, Carney said at a news conference on Parliament Hill. The demand drivers behind the strategy are specific and measurable. Electric vehicles require charging infrastructure at scale, millions of EVs drawing power from the grid simultaneously, with peak demand profiles that the existing distribution network was not designed to handle. AI data centers are among the most energy-intensive facilities ever built, with single large installations consuming as much electricity as a small city. Canada's stated goal of becoming a clean energy exporter to Europe and Asia requires surplus generation capacity beyond domestic needs. The electrification of industrial processes, steel manufacturing, chemical production. Cement requires industrial-scale power supply that natural gas has historically provided, but that decarbonization targets require electricity to replace. The strategy's affordability target is precise. The plan aims to lower energy costs for 70% of Canadian households. That target reflects a political reality that has complicated clean energy planning in Canada. And globally, the transition to lower emission electricity sources has in several jurisdictions produced higher consumer prices rather than lower ones, undermining public support for the transition. Carney's framing explicitly connects grid expansion to household affordability rather than treating them as competing objectives. The most significant policy shift embedded in the strategy is the decision to give more flexibility to LNG power plants under Canada's clean electricity regulations. The previous regulatory framework, developed under the Justin Trudeau government, was designed to phase out essentially all fossil fuel-based electricity generation by 2050. Under some interpretations of those regulations, building new natural gas generation to complement renewable capacity additions would have been difficult or impossible. Carney addressed this directly. Under some interpretations of the current electricity regulations, it would be difficult to build some additional natural gas that would complement much bigger builds, Carney said. He called the measure a very practical approach that recognizes not all provinces are starting at the same place. Adding gas will help deliver affordability. We have some of the cheapest gas in the world in Canada, he said. The LNG flexibility decision reflects a pragmatic acknowledgement that Canada's provinces are at fundamentally different starting points in their electricity systems. Quebec and British Columbia generate approximately 90% of their electricity from hydropower, among the lowest carbon grids in the world. Ontario's grid is approximately 94% non-emitting, combining nuclear, hydro, and wind. Alberta and Saskatchewan, by contrast, rely heavily on natural gas for electricity generation and are early in their transition timelines. A national strategy that imposes identical regulatory requirements on provinces with radically different generation mixes would create affordability and reliability crises in the provinces still heavily dependent on natural gas without producing proportional emissions benefits. The regulatory flexibility is designed to allow those provinces to add renewables incrementally while maintaining gas generation as a reliability backstop during the transition. The labor market dimension of the strategy is documented in specific numbers. The government forecasts 130,000 new workers will be needed to double the size of the grid. Carney said in his remarks, 30,000 jobs will be created by the end of 2028 and 100,000 more by 2050. The 30,000 jobs by 2028 target is the near-term deliverable against which the strategy's early implementation will be evaluated. The longer-term 100,000 figure represents the sustained employment base that a permanently doubled grid requires for construction, maintenance, operation, and ongoing expansion. The workforce constraint the strategy acknowledges is the one that could most directly threaten its timeline. But right now, over 80% of employers in the electricity sector are facing labor shortages, Carney said. That figure, 80% of electricity sector employers currently unable to fill positions, describes a sector that is already struggling to maintain existing infrastructure at current capacity, let alone execute the largest grid expansion in Canadian history. The strategy commits to addressing this through consultations on workforce measures targeted specifically to electricity sector needs, but does not yet specify the training programs, immigration pathways, or apprenticeship expansions required to produce the 130,000 workers the doubling requires. Electricity accounts for approximately 7% of Canada's total greenhouse gas emissions. That share has fallen substantially over the last 15 years, as most provinces reduced or eliminated coal-fired generation. The strategy does not include a commitment to eliminate emissions from Canada's grid by 2050, a shift from the Trudeau government's Clean Electricity Plan, which made that promise explicit. Carney's strategy is described as national rather than clean, a deliberate reframing that prioritizes expansion and affordability alongside emissions reduction rather than treating emissions reduction as the overriding constraint. The strategy mentions energy-saving retrofits for up to 1 million households funded through loans, grants, and complementary measures. It commits to building electricity capacity in Canada's north, but does not specify how, other than stating that Ottawa will work with territorial and Indigenous stakeholders to develop those projects. Northern electricity access is a specific policy priority because many remote communities currently rely on diesel generation, expensive, high emission, and logistically complex to supply, and connecting them to broader grid infrastructure would simultaneously reduce costs, reduce emissions, and improve energy security for those communities. The strategy does not specify total government expenditure. The $1 trillion figure in the strategy document represents the total construction cost across public and private investment combined, not a federal spending commitment of that magnitude. The public contribution will come through tax credits, loans, grants, and the Canada Infrastructure Bank, alongside private sector investment from utilities, renewable energy developers, nuclear operators, and transmission companies. The ratio of public to private investment required to reach the $1 trillion total has not been specified. Former NDP leader Tom Mulcair, commenting on the announcement, said Canadians will be cheering this one, but that the devil is in the details. The details that remain unspecified, total federal expenditure, the pathway to the 2030 climate targets, the mechanism for producing 130,000 new electricity sector workers, and the specific projects that will constitute the initial phase of grid expansion are the questions that will determine whether the $1 trillion strategy translates from a declared objective into constructed capacity. The broader geopolitical significance of doubling Canada's electricity grid extends well beyond domestic energy policy. Canada currently exports electricity to the United States. Approximately 60 terawatt hours per year flow south across the border, primarily from Quebec and British Columbia's hydroelectric surplus. A doubled grid creates the conditions for substantially larger cross-border electricity exports. At a moment when American grid operators are facing acute capacity shortfalls from the simultaneous closure of coal plants, the retirement of aging nuclear facilities, and the surge in power demand from AI data centers and EV charging infrastructure. The United States is projected to require hundreds of gigawatts of new generation capacity over the next 2 decades, that its own permitting systems, workforce constraints, and transmission planning processes are struggling to deliver on the required timeline. Canadian surplus, clean electricity, hydro, nuclear, wind, and solar feeding into an expanded national grid with new east-west transmission connections is a commercially and strategically valuable export product that commands premium pricing in American wholesale electricity market. Every gigawatt of Canadian clean electricity that flows into New England, New York, Michigan, or the Pacific Northwest reduces American dependence on fossil fuel generation while generating export revenue for Canadian utilities and Canadian governments. The trade conflict of the past 18 months has demonstrated the cost of energy dependence on a single customer. It has also demonstrated the commercial and geopolitical value of being the country that holds the energy supply the other side cannot easily replace. A doubled Canadian electricity grid producing clean power at scale from resources that no other country can replicate at comparable cost positions Canada as an energy exporter in a sector that will define economic competitiveness for the next 50 years.